Okay, so we begin last week, as we mentioned. I'm going to share the screen, and this is, of course, the blessing. Last week's portion was the story of Isaac's twins, Esav and Yaakov, or Esau and Jacob, and this dramatic, very dramatic story: how the father loves Esav, mother loves Jacob. Father wants to bless Esav before he dies. Mother intervenes. It convinces Jacob to trick his father, dress up like Esav, and steal the blessings. As a result, last week's parsha, mother realizes that Esav is not happy, of course, and is going to take revenge and may kill his brother Jacob. So she tells him, run away. Why don't you run away to my family in Haran, and there you'll find a wife. I'm sorry. So he says, run away to protect yourself from Esav. Then she tells her husband, well, maybe tell Jacob to marry a wife from my family. So now that's what Isaac does. Isaac and Rebekah both send away Jacob. But remember, they're doing so for two different reasons. Rebekah is afraid that Esav, the older son, is going to kill Jacob, the younger son. So she says, for her, it's also a mission of protection. But she doesn't want to tell her husband that his beloved son, Esav, that she suspects his beloved son, Esav, of killing. So instead, she says, for him, she says it's just for marriage. So here you have two parents agreeing on the same result, but each one has a different motive and an agenda. In any case, that's the opening part of this week's parsha, where Isaac is going to, where Jacob is now leaving Israel, heading toward Haran. And as we will read, the parsha covers the 20-year period that Jacob is in Haran. The parsha begins with him leaving Israel, going to Haran, and the parsha concludes with him heading back to Israel exactly or approximately 20 years later. Okay, so we'll share the screen again. We're going to read last week's nutshell, and then we're going to go to this week's. So this is last week. Isaac and Rebekah endure 20 childless years until their prayers are answered, and Rebekah conceives. She experiences a difficult pregnancy. As the children struggle inside her, God tells her that there are two nations in your womb, and that the younger will prevail over the elder. So she has insight into a prophecy that perhaps is what leads her to favor the younger one, because God says that eventually the younger one will prevail over the older one. In any case, Esav emerges first. Jacob is born clutching Esav's heel. That's why he gets the name Esav. I'm sorry, Yaakov. Yaakov comes from the word akev, heel. That's one of the reasons. It's a strange name, but maybe we'll talk about it later. In any case, Esav grows up to be a cunning hunter, a man of the field. Jacob is a wholesome man, a dweller in the tents of learning. Isaac favors Esau. Rebekah loves Jacob. Returning exhausted and hungry from the hunt one day, Esau sells his birthright, his right as the firstborn, to Jacob for a pot of red lentil stew. Okay, so now we know that there was a sale, and Esau sells his birthright to his younger brother. In Gerar, in the land of the Philistines, Isaac presents Rebekah as his sister out of fear that he will be killed by someone coveting her beauty. He farms the land, reopens the wells dug by his father Abraham, and digs a series of his own wells. Over the first two, there is strife with the Philistines, but the waters of the third well are enjoyed in tranquility. Esav marries two Hittite women. Isaac grows old and blind and expresses his desire to bless Esau before he dies. While Esau goes off to hunt for his father's favorite food, Rebekah dresses Jacob in Esav's clothes, covers his arms and neck with goat skins to simulate the feel of his hairier brother, prepares a similar dish, and sends Jacob to his father. Jacob receives his father's blessings for the dew of the heaven and the fat of the land, and mastery over his brothers. When Esau returns and deception is revealed, all Isaac can do for his weeping son is to predict that he will live by a sword. And that when Jacob falters, the younger brother will forfeit his supremacy over the elder. Jacob leaves home for Haran to flee Esav's wrath and to find a wife in the family of his mother's brother, Laban. Laban was his mother's brother. Esau marries a third wife, Machlat, the daughter of Ishmael. Okay, that's last week. That was last week. Now we jump to this week. This is, again, Vayetze. Vayetze, we're going back to Isaac departing. Vayetze means he went out. So Jacob leaves his hometown of Beersheba and journeys to Haran. On the way, he encounters the place and sleeps there, dreaming of a ladder connecting heaven and earth, with angels climbing and descending on it. So this is a very interesting image. We have a dream. It's not clear what the dream is saying. There are many different interpretations. Hopefully we'll get to that. But in any case, so he dreams of the ladder, and then sort of after the dream of the ladder, sort of the second half of the dream, there's revelation. So God appears and promises that the land upon which he lies will be given to his descendants. In the morning, Jacob raises the stone on which he laid his head as an altar and a monument, pledging that it will be made the house of God. So that's on his way. That's his way out. So in other words, he's leaving, but we have to have what is he taking with him? What's the encouragement that would allow him to survive in a foreign land? That's the vision and the image of the ladder and the subsequent revelation. So we'll talk about that. In Haran, Jacob stays with and works for his uncle Laban, tending Laban's sheep. Laban agrees to give him his younger daughter, Rachel, whom Jacob loves, in marriage in return for 7 years' labor. But on the wedding night, in other words, first he works for 7 years, then he marries her, then he can marry her. But here's the great deception, as we all know the story. But on this wedding night, Laban gives him his elder daughter, Leah, instead. A deception Jacob discovers only in the morning. Jacob marries Rachel too a week later, after agreeing to work another 7 years for Laban. So he works for 7 years for Rachel. He's tricked, so he marries Leah. And then a week later, he says, okay, the father-in-law says, okay, you want to marry Rachel, but then you're going to have to work for another 7 years, which is what he does. Leah gives birth to 6 sons, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Judah, Yisachar, and Zevulun, and a daughter, Dinah. It's not exactly in the right order. In other words, the other wives give birth in between these 6, but eventually Leah has 6 children, 6 and a daughter, while Rachel remains barren. Rachel gives Jacob her handmaid, Bilhah, as a wife to bear children in her stead. And 2 more sons, Dan and Naphtali, are born. Leah does the same with her handmaid, Zilpah, who gives birth to Gad and Asher. Finally, Rachel prayers are answered, and she gives birth to Joseph. So finally now, Jacob has 11 sons, including Joseph, Rachel's son. Jacob has now been in Haran for 14 years and wishes to return home. But Laban persuades him to remain, now offering him sheep in return for his labor. Jacob prospers despite Laban's repeated attempts to swindle him. After 6 years, Jacob leaves Haran in wealth, fearing that Laban would prevent him from leaving with the family and property for which he labored. Laban pursues Jacob, but is warned by God in a dream not to harm him. Laban and Jacob make peace in the Mount of Galeed, attested to by a pile of stones. Galeed literally means this pile will be a witness. So that's the symbol of their peace. And Jacob proceeds to the Holy Land, where he is met by angels. So again, this story covers the full experience of Jacob in Haran from when he leaves, going out until he's heading back to his homeland. So that is the story in a nutshell, as they say. That's the story in a nutshell. And now we want to think about what is the big picture, what's happening here, what is the deeper interpretation, and of course, what's the relevance to us. So we have a lot to do. So the first thing I want to mention, sort of as an introduction, is that we have 3 patriarchs. Why do we have 3 patriarchs? In other words, you have one patriarch. If Abraham is our patriarch, then of course Isaac is also the son of Abraham, so we're in his lineage as well. But if we say we have 3 patriarchs, what we're saying is the Jewish people need 3 patriarchs. Each one contributes something to the Jewish story. In other words, Abraham's quality is necessary for the Jewish people. Isaac's quality is necessary for the Jewish people, and Jacob's quality is essential for the Jewish people. Now, after the 3 patriarchs, we have 12 tribes, and we have many other great sages, and we could learn something from everybody. That's all true. But when we say it's patriarch, means that quality is critical for the Jewish people. In other words, they each have a unique quality that is unique and is incorporated within our collective DNA or collective soul or collective psyche. So now the question becomes, what does each one of the patriarchs contribute to the story? Why do we need them to be a critical part of the Jewish people? So there are many ways of thinking about this. Usually we think about this in terms of the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah teaches that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob represent three primary emotions. And within our life, within every soul, we each have our Abraham, our Isaac, and our Jacob. And all three are critical. That's why all three are considered our patriarchs. And we always say Abraham is love, Isaac is discipline or commitment, and Jacob is compassion. And we can talk about what they mean, but that's what we usually say. Now I want to take it a little bit differently. In other words, not move away a little from Kabbalah and become a little bit more practical and say what, not that the Kabbalah is not practical, I take that back. I meant tangible. What does Abraham do? And how is Isaac's life different than Abraham? And how is Jacob's life different than both Abraham and Isaac? Okay, so that's what we want to think about. And we're not talking about their lives collectively because they each lived very long lives and there's so much to talk about. But we want to focus on the stories that the Torah tells. So what are the challenges that define the stories that the Torah is telling us about them? And based on the challenge, that's how we will know what is their main contribution. And if you think about it, the contribution of Abraham and Isaac are very different. And then we're going to get to Jacob. This is all introduction to Jacob. So what is Abraham? Abraham is the ability to start something new, to create a revolution of ideas, to stand up and go against the entire society and be able to create something new, a new idea, a new philosophy, a new way of living, a new way of thinking. It's the strain of being a revolutionary and not being afraid to lead and to create something new. And that's Abraham. He creates monotheism. He comes to Israel, spreading the name of Hashem. He's very charismatic. He's a leader. People are following him. He's creating this new idea, very exciting. He has that charisma. He has that passion. He has that commitment. And he's a wonderful figure that we need in our history. And if we need it in our history, it means we also need that within ourselves. We have to have the ability to create new ideas. That's one very important quality. Now, if you look at Isaac, we didn't have time to speak about Isaac last week, because we weren't here last week, but I wasn't here last week. But in any case, there are few stories in the Torah about Isaac, but it's interesting that most of them are almost a repeat of his father's stories with some changes. There's not a lot of drama about Isaac. Many people think he was a very uncharismatic guy and somebody with not a lot of personality, but it's not necessarily true. In other words, if you look carefully at the stories of Isaac and you see that Isaac has a unique challenge. There's the idea of creating a revolution, creating a new idea, starting a new business. That takes a certain quality of being a certain creativity. But creativity is not enough. You also need to perpetuate this idea. To have an idea, create something new is wonderful. But if you can keep it going over generations, that takes a different commitment. And that takes somebody who doesn't need to have the excitement of creating something new and is able to commit to something and to continue something that was already started without that boost of energy of saying, wow, I'm creating something new. So it's a commitment to continue the day in, day out, to take care of the details, to allow to perpetuate for an idea that was already created, right? You have people that every time you speak to them, they have a new idea for a new book, for a new business, for a new whatever it is. They're always creating new ideas, but they don't do any, but they never carry through. Why? Because they're very good at the creative process, but they're not that good at the implementation, because implementation takes a different set of skills. And certainly implementation over generations to create something that will be enduring. So the second generation has a unique challenge. The second generation has to continue the new idea, but now it's not new and exciting anymore, right? If you think about it, as Israeli society faces this challenge. So in the beginning of the history of the modern state of Israel, people were very motivated by creating a new Jewish state. And they came from all over the world and they sacrificed to create a new Jewish state. Then you have, after that, people continued because they thought the state is very fragile, they have to invest. Comes to a certain point where many thousands or tens of thousands is a real problem, and some of the most educated Israelis are moving out of Israel. And they say we're going to find our fortunes elsewhere. We're going to look for our future elsewhere. What's the challenge? The challenge is that they don't have that same excitement that their parents had, because their parents were starting something new. They are called upon to continue something that already has been created. It's very difficult to do so because if you don't have that sense of excitement. So we have two skills that are necessary for our patriarch. We have two skills that are necessary for the Jewish people to survive. And we each have to incorporate, we each have that quality within ourselves because we're the descendants of the patriarchs. What does Abraham represent? Abraham represents the ability to create something new and to revolutionize and to come up with a new idea and to have creativity. And that's all beautiful. But Abraham himself is not going to be able to be the patriarch. It's like a stool that needs three legs. So you have Abraham himself, one leg is not enough. You need other legs. And what's Isaac? Isaac is, can I perpetuate the idea, the exciting idea that was exciting for me yesterday, but today I'm already in the grind of the specific details. I don't have that same excitement. Can I perpetuate that? And that's relevant in every area of life. You make a commitment. You say, okay, from now to the new year, I'm making a New Year's resolution. I'm going to live a healthier lifestyle. Okay, the first day it's exciting because it's something new. After a while, it becomes more difficult because you have to bring that excitement into action in the small, specific steps. That takes a separate commitment. That, ladies and gentlemen, is Isaac. It's not as glorious. It's not as glorified. It's not as exciting. He's not going to get the Nobel Peace Prize for creating a new idea, but he's going to be able to continue the idea and perpetuate it. And that is, in some sense, even harder. Okay, so we have Abraham, we have Isaac. That was all good for the past. What's Jacob this week? What's Jacob? How would you frame everything that happens in Jacob's life? And how would you say that is relevant to us? In other words, what is Jacob's contribution? One of the contributions, at least the contribution that we're going to focus on right now. What is his primary contribution to the story and to our ability to survive as a people? And what you see in this parsha is 20 years of Jacob's life. Most of Jacob's drama is in this week's parsha. After this, what happens? We don't really hear much about Jacob. It's a lot about the sons. Jacob's sons take over the scene, the conflict between the sons. So this, if you want to say that one parsha where you really see Jacob's own life, is this week's parsha. Where does this week's parsha take place? It takes place outside of Israel. What's Jacob's primary challenge? Jacob's primary challenge is, could the Jewish people survive in exile? In other words, could we survive in a distant place? Abraham, at least when we get the story, creates the revolution, new idea, new way of life, new monotheism, new religion, new faith. We're going to create a society based on moral justice. Beautiful. But he comes to Israel to do so. God says, you have to do it in this land. This is the land where all this is supposed to happen. Isaac, because Isaac is really perpetuating the ideas of Abraham, he has to remain in Israel. God says, you cannot leave the land of Israel. Even Abraham left Israel when there was a famine, but Isaac was not allowed to leave the land of Israel because Isaac's job is to lay roots to Abraham's revolution. Okay, now the question is, could this revolution, could this idea, could this lifestyle, the values of Judaism, the values of justice and the values of kindness, could they survive in a foreign environment where you don't have your own country, where you're living amongst another people and amongst other values and competing values and sometimes contradictory values? That, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of Jacob. Jacob builds his family, attains his success, financial success, not living in the land of Israel, but while in a foreign land. And it's also very interesting when you look at the patriarchs, also you hear a lot of stories about their diplomacy, how they're dealing with the king of Egypt, how they're dealing with the king of the Philistines, and how they're trying to, Isaac, for example, Isaac is making peace with Avimelech, the king of Gerar. So and it's multi-generational peace treaty. They make a peace treaty for 4 generations that they're going to have peace between each other for 4 generations. This is almost in the story of a nation, building a nation. Abraham and Isaac are building a nation. Jacob, most of his struggle, all of his struggles in this week's parsha is personal. His own family, his own father-in-law. How is he going to survive and earn a living in a hostile environment where the people will believe that his success is because he's dishonest and because he's stealing their resources, right? One of the first cases of anti-Semitism is this week's parsha, where Laban's children tell everybody that Jacob stole his fortune from their father. So the point, what I'm trying to say is that Isaac, all his challenges, both physical challenges and spiritual challenges, is the ability to be able to create a home for himself with his own values, even though he's in a distant land, not in his natural habitat. And that's the big idea of Jacob. And in some sense, that's the most relevant for us, because if we are outside of Israel and we're living much where we are in a foreign society, so we need the story of Jacob to help us understand how do you survive that environment. So now we have to go back and read Jacob's going out of Israel as our story. We too are going to a foreign environment, and maybe what Jacob experiences will help us be able to reach our purpose and our goal within our life, within the purpose of our creation, because in some sense, Jacob is the one closest to our way of living. So in that sense, well, now we have to read it much more carefully, because maybe it's much more relevant to us than we realized. And by the way, the Kabbalists explain that Jacob coming down to a foreign land, leaving the land of Israel, the Kabbalists say it's relevant to everybody, even people living in Israel, because metaphorically speaking, the soul leaving the comfort of heaven and descending into the earth, that is the first verse of this week's Parsha. Jacob left the Be'er Sheva, which is really the well of the oath. Last week's Parsha, that place, 2 weeks ago, we read how that place was called Be'er Sheva because Abraham made an oath with the king of the Philistines. And that's why that place is called Be'er Sheva. So Jacob leaving, let's see if I could pull up the verse. Right, the opening verse of this week's Parsha, Vayetze Yaakov. And Jacob left Be'er Sheva and went to Haran. Say the Kabbalists, that every soul, Jacob is the soul coming into the body. And Jacob leaving Be'er Sheva is literally the well of the oath, is the soul leaving its place in heaven. Because the Talmud says that before the soul descends into the earth, the soul is given an oath, and it takes an oath that it's going to be righteous. It's actually from the Talmud, but it's also the opening statement of the Chabad, the foundational book of Chabad, the Tanya, opens up by saying, Tanya, we learned in the end of the tractate Nida that when the soul comes into the earth, then that God makes it take an oath that it will be righteous. And that theme is explored in the book of Tanya. But what I'm trying to say here is, Kabbalistically, an oath is not just an oath where we make you promise you're going to do something, but Kabbalistically speaking, an oath is an empowerment. When you have an oath, when you take an oath, you get more spiritual energy. So Jacob leaves Be'er Sheva and went to Haran. Haran comes from the word Charon, wrath, the place of where there's wrath. In other words, the wrath of God. In other words, there is a place where God's presence is hidden. So in other words, Jacob being in Haran could refer to us being in the exile, or more broadly, it could be to refer to the soul being on this earth. So we're all in a hostile environment in some sense or the other. Even if you are living in Jerusalem and you are only eating falafel. No, I'm kidding. You're living in Jerusalem and living in a spiritual environment, assuming that's what you're doing. Even then, the story of Jacob is relevant to you, because you are also in a hostile environment spiritually, because your soul left the figurative land of Israel, which is heaven, and comes down into the earth. Okay, that's all introduction. Introduction is the story of Jacob is the story of being in an exile, either literal exile outside of Israel or figurative exile being on this earth. And what do we see? What's the takeaway? How does Jacob's experience match up to that of his father and grandfather? And here we see something fascinating. Here we see that not only does he surpasses them in many ways, even though he's in a much more difficult environment. And the most important way where he surpasses them is that he is successful in raising a family of 12 children, or 13, if you count Dinah, 12 tribes, but 13 children. And all of his children remain loyal to his teachings. Unlike Abraham and Isaac, who each have one child that carries their legacy, but another child that drifts away, at least one child that drifts away. Now, you would think the opposite was true. If I tell you we have three patriarchs, two of them raised children in Israel, and one of them raises a child in the diaspora, I guess in the exile, where there's a foreign culture, and I say, which one was successful in keeping their children loyal to their teachings? I would guess that it was the people who were in Israel, Abraham and Isaac, who would be successful. And yet, what we find is that no, Jacob specifically is the one who's successful in raising all of his children in line with his teaching. So what does this tell us about the broader idea? The broader idea tells us that when you have challenges are challenging, but challenges also help bring out deeper energy within yourself and deeper parts of your character that you didn't know that you had. And challenges force you to dig deeper. And therefore, when the challenge happens, when your person is challenged, they can actually surpass what they would have accomplished had there been no challenge. And that is something, a very important point. It's not just about the children, but it's about every area of life, including the big idea of the soul coming down into this earth. Because the soul coming down to this earth, which is really, metaphorically speaking, Isaac leaving the land of Israel, the comforts of the land of Israel, and going, spiritual comforts, and going to a foreign land, that's the soul descending into this earth. The soul is very challenged in this earth. This is a hostile environment for the soul. And yet, specifically because of being in this earth, that's why the soul is able to achieve greater commitment to God, because the challenge forces the soul to have a more real and more deeper and more authentic relationship with God. So that is a very important theme that you get from the big picture of the Parsha before we get to the details. And I want to connect it just with one verse, and we'll read the verse inside, and we'll talk about that for a minute or two just to bring everything home. And then we'll go back to the actual story and hear about the drama and Jacob marrying two sisters, being tricked and marrying Leah instead of Rachel. A lot of drama here. It could make for a good Hollywood movie, actually better than a Hollywood movie. But in any case, we'll get to that as well. But I want to just read one verse. So this is within the Jacob is leaving Israel. He goes to sleep at the place. Which place? The sages say that the place is the place of the Holy Temple, Mount Moriah. So this is Mount Moriah. This is the Holy Temple. And that's where he sees the vision, right? He dreamed, and behold, a ladder set up on the ground, and its top reached for heaven. And behold, angels of God were ascending and descending upon it. And then you have a vision, and then you have a revelation. What happens? God says as follows. And behold, the Lord was standing over him. And he said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, the God of Isaac, the land which you are lying on it, I will give it to your seed. Okay, here is a very famous verse, 14. One of the reasons why it's famous in Chabad, this was sort of the mission statement of Chabad that the Rebbe used in the 1950s for the Chabad's outreach, which is to spread all over the earth. He quoted verse 12. They even have a Chabad song on this verse, that they always sang in the Rebbe's presence. Here is the verse. And your seed shall be as the dust of the earth, and you shall gain strength. Not a perfect translation. Paratzta means you should burst forward. Burst forward means you should spread, but with a force that is much more powerful than just going. It's bursting forth. The bursting forth usually implies there's an obstacle, and then you break through the obstacle. But in any case, you shall burst forth westward and eastward, and northward and southward. And through you shall be blessed all the families of the earth, and through your seed. So the song, the Chabad song, is Ufaratzta. You shall gain strength. You shall burst forth westward, eastward, northward, and southward. That was the mission statement that the Rebbe coined for Chabad. In any case, what do we see in this verse? So the first thing we see is your seed shall be as the dust of the earth. Now, let's think about this for a second. What is God saying? So God is saying that you'll have many children. But that's not the only way to say you'll have many children. When God speaks to Abraham, what does God tell Abraham? God tells Abraham, your seed will be like the stars of heaven. Are there more stars or more sands? Do we know? They do the math. They think there's a lot more stars, like tenfold. I don't know the numbers, but in any case, a lot more stars than kernels of sand, or what do you say? Kernel? I don't know. You say something. Specks of sand. I don't know what you say. But in any case, you have two blessings here. You have two blessings. You have two ways of saying there'll be many children. To Abraham, God says, we'll be like the stars. To Jacob, God says, we'll be like the dust of the earth. So what does that mean? It's just two things that are plentiful. So the commentaries say, no. There's two ideas here. Being the stars represent the Jewish people when they are in a very high spiritual level. When we are in exile, both physically and spiritually, in some sense, we're like the dust of the earth. In the sense that we are low, both physically and spiritually. People tread upon us physically, but also spiritually, we don't have that same connection to God that we had in the times of the temple when we were able to come and serve God in the temple in the proper fashion. So what the opening verse of the statement, your seed should be like, your seed will be like the afar ha'aretz, like the dust of the earth, does not seem to be very complimentary when you compare it to the blessing his grandfather had. His grandfather has, God tells his grandfather, your seed will be like the stars of the heaven. So what would you rather be, dust of the earth or stars of the heaven? I would rather be stars of the heaven. And yet, according to the Kabbalah, Hasidic interpretation, because you'll be like the dust of the earth. In other words, because you're coming down to a physical, hostile environment and there are challenges, that is why you'll be able to gain strength and burst forward, eastward, westward, northward, and southward. In other words, the challenge creates the ability to come forth with greater might. You have the metaphor the Hasidic philosophy brings is that when you look at the stream of water flows very, very, very calmly. Then you throw in a few stones, and that creates resistance. And the resistance creates the flowing to flow with much more vigor. All of a sudden, you have white water. All of a sudden, there's a rush. What happened here? It's a physical expression of the spiritual truth. And that is that when you put an obstacle in the way of the water is going to have to burst forward and overcome. And that's the story of Jacob. That's really the story of Jacob, which is really the story of every soul coming into this earth, and certainly the story of the Jewish people when they are in exile. And that is that we're not in our spiritual natural habitat, but yet that specifically is the reason, because of the struggles that come from being in a distant environment and a challenging environment, that's where we can achieve greater success, because the purpose of the challenge is to elicit deeper commitment and deeper power and deeper strength. All this is by way of introduction, and any comments or questions, please share. Otherwise, I'm going to skip straight to the story of Leah and Rachel, because the story of the ladder is in the beginning of the story. We read about it every year. It's already 10:37. I don't want to get stuck there. We want to get to the core of the issue here. And if you want to hear more about the Parsha, please come back next year, same time, same place, in good health. Okay, but now we're going to go to Rachel and Leah. Unless anybody has a comments, questions, jokes, observations, stories, whatever you want to share is good. Otherwise, we continue. Okay, I'm just giving you a trigger warning. This is a very sad story. The tension in Jacob's home. It's a sad story because it creates a tension between two sisters. By the way, this is a very interesting concept. The Torah, before the Torah was given, in the Torah, polygamy is permitted. A person can marry more than one wife. Not recommended, but it's permitted. Even so, there is a prohibition in the Torah against marrying two sisters. And the reason for that is that marrying two women creates a certain tension between the two of them, and it's unnatural and cruel to create that sense of tension between two sisters who naturally are like each other. So the Hebrew word that the sages use to describe it is a tzara. In Yiddish, a tzara is a problem, like a tzara is a difficulty. But in the Hebrew of the Mishnah, a tzara means the other wife. For one wife and the other wife are tzarot. They're quote unquote trouble. In other words, it's a very difficult relationship between the two. And here, after the Torah was given, you're not allowed to marry two sisters, which creates a whole discussion of how come Jacob married two sisters. But that's another story. I'm not going to get into that technicality right now. All I'm trying to say is this is not a happy story. This is a story with tremendous amount of tension and pain. And if you know the end of the story doesn't end when Rachel passes away, which she passes away next week's Parsha. She dies young, unfortunately. Well, so the story doesn't end there. The tension doesn't end there. The pain of this tension between the two sisters also carries on to the next generation. And in a sense, the conflict between the children of Jacob, between Joseph and his brothers, that culminate in the fact that the brothers sell Joseph as a slave, which really affects all of Jewish history because that causes all the Jewish people to go to Egypt and eventually descend into slavery. So all that is probably a result of the tension in the family of marrying two sisters. So this is a painful story. But just because it's a painful story, it doesn't mean that it's not an important story or that it doesn't have significance for us. So that's what we're going to try to do. We're going to try to read the story, see a few verses, and see what is the spiritual significance. And if we have time, we'll also try to connect it to the previous story of Jacob stealing the blessings. We'll see what we can do. So here we go. So we are looking at Jacob. Jacob comes to Haran. He meets Rachel at the well. That's another story. She introduces him to her father, Lavan, who invites him in. Now we have sort of an introduction. Now Laban has two daughters. The name of the elder was Leah. The name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were tender, but Rachel had beautiful features and a beautiful complexion. You turn the page. So we're reading Genesis chapter 29, verse 18. Jacob loved Rachel, and he said, I will work for you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. Laban said, it is better that I give her to you than I should give her to another man. Stay with me. A great deal. So he worked 7 years. One of the most beautiful verses in the Torah is verse 20. So Jacob worked for Rachel 7 years, but they appeared to him like a few days because his love for her. He loves her so much that the effort it takes to earn her hand doesn't seem difficult, because when you're in love, nothing is hard. 21. And Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife, for my days are completed, that I may come to her. So Laban gathered all the people of his place, and he made a feast. And it came to pass in the evening that Laban took his daughter Leah and brought her to him, and he came to her. In other words, he tricked him. He sends Leah instead of Rachel. And Laban gave Zilpah, his maidservant, to his daughter Leah as a maidservant. And it came to pass in the morning, and behold, she was Leah. So he said to Laban, what is this that you have done to me? Did I not work with you? Did I not work with you for Rachel? Why have you deceived me? And Laban said, it is not done so in our place to give the younger one before the firstborn. You're not going to you can't marry off the younger daughter before you marry off the older daughter. So I gave you the older daughter. So I'm the honest one. I'm living according to the local custom. Well, you should have told that to Jacob 7 years ago, right? About 7 years late. But that's the other story. Laban is the trickster who tries to appear moral and as if he's acting in the right. In any case, he gives them another deal. Complete the wedding week of this one, and we will give you this one too, for the work that you will render for me for another 7 years. And Jacob did so, and he completed the week for this one, and he gave his daughter Rachel to him as a wife. And Laban gave his daughter Rachel his maidservant Bilhah for a maidservant, and he came also to Rachel, and he also loved Rachel more than Leah, and he worked with him yet another 7 years. And here is probably one of the most painful verses of the story. And the Lord saw that Leah was hated, so he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. It's a very difficult story. Snua Leah, Leah's hated. What does it mean she's hated? Does it mean he hated her? You're not allowed to be with a woman who you hate. Maybe it means he hated her in relation to Rachel. Maybe if you love someone more, then the one you love less feels hated. Maybe he hated that he was tricked. So it's certainly a difficult verse. And the story continues that she has 4 children, one after the other. And then Rachel's upset because Rachel's barren, and the story unfolds. Okay, so what's happening here? And how does this story relate to the bigger picture? So I'm going to give you the Kabbalistic interpretation. We'll go straight in, and then we'll see what it means for us. So you have 2 woman, Rachel and Leah, two sisters, Rachel and Leah. And Jacob loves one, but ends up marrying both. Now, in the beginning, it says that Leah was hated. The older one was hated. But if you think about Jacob's life, for most of his life, he was married to Leah, not Rachel, because Rachel died soon after he came to the land of Israel. So he was married to Rachel for exactly 15 years. How many years? He was married to Rachel for 13 years. That was the whole story. And Leah, he was married to for the rest of his life. Not only that, if you look where they were buried. So Rachel was buried on the side of the road in the tomb of Rachel. You can go see it today. Because even though it's in Beit Lechem, it's still under Israeli control. So you can go visit Rachel. She's on the road. But who was Jacob buried with? Jacob was not buried with Rachel, the woman he loved. He was buried with Leah, the woman who, at least in the beginning, he didn't love her. Maybe even worse, maybe hated her. But the verse says she was hated, whatever that means. So we have an interesting paradox. He's got two women. He loves one. He ends up marrying both. And eventually, he lives most of his life, and most of his children come from Leah. And Leah's children, in some sense, reach greater heights. We have Leah's children are the ones who become the sort of the leaders of the Jewish people. Tribe of Judah, the kings come from Leah's children. The priests, the tribe of Levi, come from Leah's children. So the woman who was supposed to be, who Jacob really didn't want to end up marrying, eventually comes to be the one who actually builds most of the Jewish people. So you've got 6 out of 12 tribes. And of those 6 tribes, the leadership comes from her children. And like I said, the burial, who is he buried with? He's not buried with the woman who he loved and he wanted to marry. So you could take this in all different directions. And we'll start with the end. The end is, maybe the story applies to everybody's life. We have the Rachel, we have the Leah. We think we love one. We end up realizing that the other is more important. And this is in every relationship. You marry one person, but you're really marrying 2 people, the Rachel and the Leah within the other person. So we'll get to that, to the Kabbalistic dimension. But before that, I want to pull back just simply. The Talmud says like this. The Talmud says, Rashi quotes it, the Medrash says it, Rashi quotes it, that you have 2 sons, right? 2 daughters, right? You have Leah and Rachel, Rachel and Leah. Let me just open up the Rashi so you see it inside. Pretty sure Rashi is going to say it. Yeah, here we go. You have the 2 daughters, right? Laban has 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah. The name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were tender. What does tender? What does that mean? Rakot, soft. What does that mean? There's all different interpretations. They're going to say tender here. The Rashi is going to say her eyes were tender. I don't know what tender. I don't know what eyes are tender means. But whatever the case is, it's because she was always crying. That's what Rashi says. Why was she always crying? Here, let's read the Rashi. Tender, because she expected to fall into Esav's lot. And she wept because everyone was saying, Rebekah had 2 sons and Laban has 2 daughters. The older daughter for the older son, and the younger daughter for the younger son. This comes from Tractate Baba Batra. So you know how today everybody's making a shidduch, everybody wants to make a shidduch, everyone wants to make a match. So the same in the ancient world. Everybody said you got an easy match here. You have 2 siblings, Rebekah and Laban. One lives in Israel, one lives in Haran, but it doesn't matter. And they said they each have one. Rebekah has 2 sons, Esav and Jacob. Esav and Yaakov, Esau and Jacob. Lavan has 2 daughters, Rachel and Leah. The older one should marry the older one. Esav should marry Leah, and Yaakov should marry Rachel, and everything will be fine. Now, it's a wonderful story, wonderful shidduch. It's very easy to get to make the shidduch. Everybody's happy except for Leah. Leah doesn't want to marry Esav. Esav was considered the wicked one. So she's crying all day. And Rachel is beautiful, so Yaakov wants to marry her. That's a wonderful story. What does that really mean? What's the deeper significance of this story? So Kabbalistically speaking, this is the way it works. There's two types of people. And there's two types of people in general. And if you want to generalize, of course, one is what we're going to call righteous, and the other one is what we're going to call challenged. And the righteous person, they do what's right naturally. They're not challenged. It's not difficult for them to do the right thing. And then you can have the person who's challenged. For them, everything that they do, they're challenged, and therefore they have to work hard to do the right thing. And sometimes they'll make mistakes, and hopefully they'll recover from those mistakes. So you have two children. One is gifted. One doesn't make any trouble in class. One is a straight A student. They never call you. The teacher never calls you. They leave you alone. Everything is fine. Then you have another child, for example, who is challenged. Challenge doesn't mean good or bad. Challenge means in the classroom setting, it's very difficult for them. Sometimes they can do more than the other child. They can come out with 110 on the test. But if they're going to, it's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of overcoming of challenge. And Kabbalistically speaking, that is Leah and Rachel. Rachel is beautiful. Beautiful means no challenges. Leah is challenged. And even the word Leah is a very interesting word. What does the word Leah mean? It's not clear, but some people say Leah comes from the word tired, meaning tired because of the challenges. In any case, you have two people. You have Rachel and Leah. You had two sons of Rebekah, Yaakov and Esau. Everybody said a good match would be to marry off Leah to Rachel, to Esau. Why is that? Because what's Esau? Esau is a person who was less than wholesome. But Leah, because she is challenged, Leah could affect Esau. Leah would be able to transform Esau because Leah understands his struggles. And when they said Leah is the good match for Esau, what they mean that Leah has the capacity to transform Esau. Rachel doesn't. Rachel is wholesome. Rachel's not challenged. She won't understand the challenges of Esau. So who's Rachel for? Who's Rachel for? Rachel is for Jacob. What's Jacob? Jacob in last week's parsha, he's a ish tam. He's a wholesome man. He studies intense. He's not challenged in the same way as Esau was. So that's what everybody said. And when you said she's crying, when Rashi says she's crying means because she had a difficult life, because spiritually she was challenged. And if you're Jacob and you're a wholesome person, you're not looking for trouble. What do you want? You see Jacob, you see Rachel, you fall in love with Rachel. Not just because she was beautiful, because she was beautiful, but not just because she was beautiful, but also because she was spiritually beautiful. But what does beauty mean in this context? In this context, beauty means not challenged. What turns out? Turns out, by the way, you could see the same thing in the next generation. Look at Rachel's sons and look at Leah's sons. Rachel's sons are primarily righteous. You have Benjamin and you have Joseph. Leah's sons get into all sorts of problems. They sin, they sell their brother as a slave. Judah follows the harlot with the story of Tamar. But what they do have is they have the power of transformation. They have the power of teshuvah. Despite the fact that they fail, they could transform, they could take responsibility, and they could correct their shortcomings. And in that sense, they come out ahead. So here's what we're saying here. So look at the next generation. You see who becomes the leaders of the Jewish people. Not the sons of Joseph and Benjamin, sons of Rachel, who are more beautiful, spiritually speaking. Beautiful as in the context of not challenged. They don't become the leaders. They're not even the ones that comprise the majority of the Jewish people. Yeah, there's a component of Jewish people who are righteous and unchallenged, who are beautiful, so quote unquote, in the context of beauty meaning not being challenged. Most of the Jewish people come, and the leadership of the Jewish people come from Leah, from the person who is challenged and does have a struggle and overcomes the struggle. Because that's really what we're saying, consistent with this entire theme of this parsha, which is that when you go down to the earth, when you go down to the dust, when you're in a hostile environment, you're forced to work harder and you can reach deeper heights or greater heights. So now we're looking at Jacob. Jacob says, I want to marry Rachel. But what does God send him? What does destiny send? God sends, no, you have to marry Leah. Because we'll talk about this, how come he has to marry Leah, but part of the Jewish people is incorporating the ability to be challenged and overcome challenge. And that becomes probably the more important element within the Jewish people. Now, let's go back a little bit. What happens? Let's go back a little bit. What happens earlier? What happens earlier is Rebecca pushes Jacob to steal Esav's blessings. What does it mean you're stealing Esav's blessings? So that's another whole story. We have 6 minutes. We can't do it all in 6 minutes, but I'll try to do it in 60 seconds. Why did Isaac want to bless Esav? Because the father felt that if you bless Esav, Esav has tremendous potential. He's very challenged, but if you could harness his energy, you can achieve great things. So he wants to bless Esav to harness Esav's energy and to bring Esav back to the fold. Rebecca says it's not going to work. Esav is too far. So you have to bless Jacob, and you have to give Jacob the ability to influence Esav. You can't influence Esav directly. You have to influence him indirectly. Sometimes a person is so far that if you give them energy and you give them power and you give them blessing, they don't know what to do with it. It's going to be counterproductive. So instead, you give Esav's blessing. In other words, Esav's spiritual achievement, what Esav is supposed to achieve, which is Esav is supposed to be the one to overcome the negativity, to overcome the challenge and transform himself. That capacity for transformation will be given to Jacob as well. So Rebecca pushes her son to take Esav's blessing, but taking Esav's blessing means you take Esav's mission. If you're taking Esav's mission, then you have to marry Esav's wife. Everybody said the older one gets the older one. Leah gets Esav. What does that mean? Leah has the power to transform Esav. So if you're going to take Esav's mission, then you have to take the person. Leah is the person who has the capacity to transform the challenge into holiness, to overcome from the challenge. So now Jacob doesn't want to marry Leah. He doesn't want to live the lifestyle where you're challenged and you have to overcome. But in reality, what comes out is that ultimately the person who he lives with for the longest, and the person who he's buried with, and the person who really becomes the primary builder of the Jewish people is the one who he was not in love with at first sight, because at first sight she wasn't as beautiful, because at first sight she was challenged. But again, consistent with the entire theme of this parsha is that the challenge produces a greater blessing and greater love and greater feelings and greater emotions in the long run. So if you have to package everything we said, is that in our life, we each have a Rachel and Leah. We have opportunities. We have what's the easy path, and we have the challenging path. We have experiences that are just enjoyable, and we have experiences that are challenging. Who do we fall in love with? Who do we want to marry? Of course, you want to marry the Rachel. Of course, you want to interact with the part of life with this tranquil and peaceful and just enjoyable. But God sends us, luckily, God sends us Leah. God sends us challenge. But more importantly, more than the challenge, God sends us the ability to grow from the challenge. And that's what Leah is. And in our life, we each have that capacity. And in our life, if we look back and we see most of the growth that we achieve not for the moments of pleasure, not for the moments of enjoyment, even though those are very important and we want that. And he marries Rachel and it's a wonderful relationship. But the real growth comes from Leah, comes from being challenged and overcoming the challenge. And that's where the Jewish people are built. And that's the story of our people. And in some sense, that's the story of the parsha as well, because the whole theme of the parsha is that when you're in a foreign land, you could grow in some sense even more and be more successful than you were in an accommodating environment. So the challenge brings out the greater blessing. So that is the story in short, a lot more to say. Come back next year, same time, same place, in good health, and we continue the journey. Of course, as always, comments, questions, jokes, please share. Otherwise, have a wonderful day.
In a previous year, you also mentioned the connection to the when we get married and have the veil, the lifting of the veil, reminding us.
Yes, so you have the Kabbalah, the Alter Rebbe talks about this. There's also other dimensions, saying the same thing in different dimensions. That based on the Zohar says that Rachel is the revealed world, Leah is the concealed world. In other words, there's the conscious and the subconscious. And Rabbi Shneur Zalman says that you love the conscious, you don't like the subconscious, because the subconscious you don't understand. And what the Zohar is saying, and what the Zohar is saying is that every person you marry has both levels. You yourself has both levels. There's the Leah and the Rachel within you. And in some sense, you're not always going to see the Leah. The Leah comes out later. You yourself don't know your own Leah. You certainly don't know the Leah of the person opposite you, right? That takes time to develop and discover. Yet, the greatest growth that a person could achieve comes not necessarily from dealing with the conscious part of my identity, but with the subconscious, because the subconscious is much more powerful. So the subconscious could create more difficulty. In other words, some of my struggles come from what's going on in the subconscious, and it's harder to deal with because if I can't identify what I'm feeling because it's in the subconscious, then it's harder to deal with. But if a person is able, and over time, a person is able to get to the deeper parts of their psyche, and that's the Leah, and that's where most of the growth comes from. So you see, it's the same theme, just using it in different ways, either projecting it internally, which is what the Kabbalah is doing and the Zohar is doing, or just talking about in the world in general, where Rachel and Leah would be revealed good and concealed good, right? So the revealed good is tranquility, is peace. Concealed good is challenge, an overcoming challenge. And what do we want? We want the Leah. We want the Rachel. What do we get? Or we get both. We get Rachel, some of Rachel, but nobody has a life of just Rachel. And if we would, it would probably be a tragedy. We have Leah as well. So that's true within ourselves. So it's true in the world in general, true within ourselves. Within ourselves, we have the beautiful part of self, the story we tell ourselves, what we feel, what we think. And then there's the subconscious. And the subconscious often is messy because we have contradictory feelings and we have things that we're less than proud of. But dealing with those parts of self, in some sense, transforming those parts of self is the capacity of Leah. So Leah is not the problem. Leah is the ability to overcome problems, is the ability to deal with challenge, the idea that the ability to transform. And that's Leah's capacity. But Jacob doesn't love that. Who wants transformation? We'd much rather have tranquility. But that's what we'd rather have. But the question is, where do we grow? Where do we actually achieve the purpose of our creation? That the arena for growth is the arena of Leah far more than the arena of Rachel.
Beautiful, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Zina. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Have a wonderful day and see each other in good health. Be well.
Goodbye.